larger landscape bustling with human activity. And here, on the nearby headland, an ongoing excavation has revealed so much more about this.
Beneath the grass of Carnoustie, Scotland, archaeologists uncovered something so vast it rewrites what we thought we knew about the first farmers. A Neolithic timber hall, older than Stonehenge by 1,000 years, and large enough to draw entire communities together. What turned a sports pitch into a time machine? How did faint stains in the soil reveal a 6,000-year-old blueprint? Today, we follow the excavation that exposed a monumental hall, its artifacts, and the wider complex that reshaped our understanding of prehistoric Scotland. Ordinary field, hidden world. Sometimes the past hides in plain sight, beneath the most ordinary of places. In the small coastal town of Carnoustie, Scotland, the story began not with an ambitious excavation, but with a simple school project. Local authorities planned to build new sports pitches at Carnoustie High School. Before construction could begin, regulations required an archaeological assessment. Such checks are routine in the United Kingdom, a safeguard that ensures traces of history are recorded before bulldozers change the land forever. Most of the time, these surveys uncover only scraps, an old field boundary, a few shards of pottery, maybe the footprint of a medieval farmstead. When Guard Archaeology was called in, the team expected exactly that: routine work. The plan was straightforward: survey the soil, dig test trenches, record any anomalies, and give the green light for construction. Nothing in the initial brief suggested a groundbreaking discovery was likely, yet from the first spadeful, the ground began to resist expectations. Subtle changes in soil color appeared almost immediately, dark stains where the earth should have been uniform. For experienced eyes, these were whispers of something more. As a general rule, no one jumps to conclusions immediately. Archaeologists are trained in caution. Discoloration in soils may well be natural due to tree roots or drainage patterns, but as the trenches grew, they revealed ever more distinct patterns. These stains were too regular, too deliberate. They lined up in rows, sometimes paired, sometimes evenly spaced. Geological quirks. These were not. They were human. The first indication of first evidence of a structure buried for thousands of years under a football pitch has been found. The site discovery halted the progress of the construction project. The construction crews who had anticipated breaking ground were now waiting around, while archaeologists measured and recorded every marking with utmost precision. Soon enough, curiosity developed among the local populace. Parents walked past the schoolyard, children going to school, and even golfers familiar with the famous courses of Carnoustie stopped to peer down the trenches. Anyone who had taken no interest could hardly imagine that under one's feet lay the footprint of something truly monumental. Routinely, surveys like this one are brushed aside, but here they became a time machine. The stains in the soil were no mere changes in color. They showed that people had lived, built, and gathered more than 6,000 years ago in what is today known as Angus. Each trench was like peeling back a layer of time to reveal hints of a world no one expected to find in Angus. Guard Archaeology's team pressed on, and the excitement continued to grow. Each new feature being recorded added to the mystery. Was this a farmstead, a cluster of huts, or something larger? The evidence pointed towards scale, but at this stage, the full picture remained hidden. What was clear, however, was that Carnoustie's school field was no ordinary patch of grass. It was a gateway into Scotland's deep past. The archaeologist could feel the excitement, and it was evident they were probably not even capable of imagining what lay ahead, as this was not really what projects normally deliver when they start with such low expectations. But here, this very place meant only sports and classrooms, and the soil here was telling about a society that thrived about 6,000 years ago. Routine paperwork had suddenly left out the back door and was becoming the site of complete excavation. The voices in the soil would soon be vocalizing and sketching out the shape of a structure unlike anything they had imagined. No standing stones, no walls, only shadows in the earth. Yet those shadows would sketch a building of impossible ambition. Ghosts in the soil. When people imagine ancient buildings, they often picture stone ruins still standing against the wind. But Scotland's earliest farmers built with wood, and wood does not last. It rots, burns, or disappears into the ground. What remains are not walls or roofs, but faint imprints in the soil. To the untrained eye, they look like nothing: random circles, darker stains, subtle discolorations. To an archaeologist, they are fingerprints of a world long vanished. And at Carnoustie, those fingerprints began to tell a story no one expected. The earliest trenches revealed circular stains that repeated in suspiciously regular patterns. They weren't natural. These were post holes, voids left when massive timbers had once been sunk into the earth. Over centuries, the posts had decayed, leaving behind ghostly marks darker than the surrounding soil. Their alignment was too precise to be random. Straight lines, evenly spaced rows, and paired impressions hinted at the framework of a structure. Seasoned archaeologists knew instantly that this was architecture, not an accident. As the team from Guard Archaeology mapped each post hole, the ground transformed into a blueprint. Two larger stains often sat side by side, doorways, the kind used for controlled entry and exit. Long parallel rows suggested roof supports, the skeletal frame of something substantial. The pattern spoke louder with every trench. This wasn't a small hut or farmstead. It was a building of ambition. Among the small but invaluable clues scattered between the post holes, one found pottery fragments, chipped stone tools, and burn traces. Such finds did not simply scatter debris. They were timekeepers. Pottery, especially, turned out to be a window to the past for the team. There were carinated bowls from Carnoustie, sharply angled vessels known as some of the earliest pottery styles in Scotland, and alongside them, sherds of unstand-style ware, which had round bases and characteristic incised decoration, a type more typical of Orkney and the Northern Isles. These fragments had weight. They anchored the site solidly in the early Neolithic, around 3,800 to 3,600 BC, and they revealed something all the more important. This community had some links with others. The pottery styles indicated cultural links that extended beyond Angus, to connections both with the continent and with the islands to the north. In fact, the people of Carnoustie belonged to a network that spread ideas, traditions, and material goods thousands of miles away. Not even soil would call for silence from sounding out activity. The traces of ashes indicated that hearths or fires had once been lit in that space, whereas evidence of remains from pits pointed to the fact that there was cooking, or perhaps a feast. Surely these are not remnants of a single family meal, but those of more than one gathering. Archaeologists. They were augmenting the understanding of each stain and sherd. It was by no means the footprint of a forgotten farmhouse, but a skeleton of a hall designed to host entire groups. At the end of the season, the image was clear. Someone would have to extend that beyond what ordinary dwellings could do. The lines of posts went further than anyone had ever supposed. It clearly showed scale, symmetry, and purpose in the maps, shaping them into blueprints. Preserved in the soil, however, was the apparition of a building where ghostly-sounding masses congregated for perhaps ritual, feasting, or decision-making. Lines on a plan grew longer and longer until a house became a hall, and a hall became a statement, raising a timber giant. As the archaeologists widened their trenches and connected the scattered post holes into lines, the true shape of the structure began to emerge. What they were looking at wasn't a cluster of huts or a simple family dwelling. It was something much bigger, carefully designed and deliberately placed. Piece by piece, the soil revealed the ghost of a hall that dwarfed anything the team had expected to find beneath a school field. When the measurements were finally tallied, the numbers stunned even the most seasoned researchers. The outline stretched to roughly 115 feet in length and nearly 30 feet across, longer than a modern basketball court and nearly as wide as a 3-lane highway. This wasn't just large for the Neolithic period, it was the largest early Neolithic timber hall ever found in Scotland. To put it in perspective, its construction dates to around 4000 BC, making it roughly 1,000 years older than Stonehenge and several centuries older than Egypt's first pyramids. How did early farmers, equipped with nothing more than stone axes and human strength, build something of this magnitude? The post holes themselves held the answer. Some were so wide and so deep that they must have supported oak timbers of enormous size, the kind of trees that would take multiple people to fell and haul into place. These posts weren't placed casually. They were set in pairs, carefully aligned, forming a framework strong enough to bear the weight of a roof that must have towered above the landscape. The walls, archaeologists believe, were constructed using wattle and daub, woven wooden panels plastered with a clay and organic mixture. Once hardened, they would have kept out wind and rain, creating a sturdy shell around the massive interior. The entrances, positioned opposite one another, were not simply functional but processional, guiding the flow of people into and out of the hall. In every detail, the building showed planning, coordination, and an understanding of how architecture could shape social life. To create such a hall, the community would have needed extraordinary cooperation. Felling and shaping massive oak trunks with stone tools was back-breaking work. Transporting them, anchoring them into the earth, and raising them into vertical positions required dozens, if not hundreds, of hands. This wasn't the labor of a small family group. It was a regional project, evidence that people came together under leadership and shared purpose. Building the hall itself was a statement, an announcement to anyone who saw it that this community was organized, capable, and ambitious. For archaeologists, the hall's sheer age deepened the impact. At a time when much of Europe was only beginning to transition from mobile lifestyles to farming, the people of Carnoustie were already creating monumental architecture. The radiocarbon dates told a story of innovation on the Scottish mainland, suggesting that Neolithic builders here were among the first to think in terms of scale and permanence. The hall wasn't just a shelter, it was infrastructure, a centerpiece around which life could revolve. Its monumental size forced archaeologists to rethink what early farmers were capable of. These were not scattered, fragile groups surviving at the margins of the North Sea. They were builders, planners, and leaders who could carve their identity into the land itself. If they could raise this, what did they do inside it? And why gather so many people under one roof? Feasts, rituals, power. The outline of the Carnoustie Hall revealed its scale, but its true meaning came from what was found inside and around it. Scattered among the post holes and pits were fragments of pottery, charred grains, animal bones, and tools. Small remnants that, when pieced together, told a story of vibrant communal life. This was not a dwelling for a single family. It was a stage where entire communities gathered, where rituals unfolded, and where power was expressed. Hearths inside the hall were the first clue. Burn marks and ash deposits indicated that fires were regularly lit within its walls. These weren't the modest hearths of household cooking, but large communal fires. Around them, people likely roasted meat, baked bread, and prepared food for dozens at once. The pottery fragments reinforced this interpretation. Carronnated bowls and other vessels bore the traces of heating, suggesting they were used to cook or serve meals in quantities far larger than any one household would need. This was evidence of feasting, of gatherings that brought together people from across the region. Communal feasts were more than celebrations. In the Neolithic world, they were political tools. Sharing food created bonds, resolved disputes, and reinforced alliances. Archaeologists believe the Carnoustie Hall may have been a focal point where seasonal harvests were celebrated, where farming families gathered to reaffirm their connections, and where decisions affecting the wider community were made. The hall's sheer size made it ideal for such occasions, a space that could host dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people under one roof. Beyond the practical evidence of food and fire, the hall's design itself suggested ritual. The processional entrances implied controlled movement, with people entering from one side and exiting from another. Such features hint at ceremonies, processions, or rituals where the very act of moving through the space carried meaning. Inside, the open interior, unbroken by walls, would have created a vast communal chamber where voices echoed and fires glowed, turning the hall into both a gathering place and a symbolic center. Artifacts uncovered around the site added more depth to this picture. Polished stone axes, finely worked arrowheads, and exotic materials like pitchstone and smoky quartz indicated networks of trade and exchange. These were not ordinary household tools left by chance. They may have been offerings, gifts, or symbols of status displayed during gatherings. Their presence suggested that Carnoustie was connected to broader Neolithic networks across Scotland and beyond, drawing people and objects into its orbit. In this light, the hall was more than just architecture. It was social technology, a way to forge unity and project identity. Building it required collective labor and leadership, but using it required repeated gatherings that reinforced community ties. The Carnoustie farmers weren't simply surviving from season to season. They were creating a social fabric strong enough to endure. This hall was their anchor, the place where farming turned into society, where food turned into ritual, and where architecture turned into power. For modern archaeologists, the realization was profound. The Carnoustie Hall wasn't just a building, it was a declaration. It told its builders and their neighbors that this community was organized, ambitious, and worthy of recognition. It shaped how people ate, celebrated, and even how they saw themselves in relation to others. Step back from the hall, and the map changes again. The outlines multiply, and a complex begins to breathe. Ripples through time. When the archaeologists finally stood back and looked at their maps, they realized the hall was only the beginning. Scattered around the site were smaller structures, working areas, storage pits, and evidence of repeated occupation. What had started as the outline of one building grew into the footprint of an entire complex. The soil beneath Carnoustie wasn't hiding a single hall. It was preserving a center of community life that stretched across generations. The finds outside the hall deepened the picture. Traces of cereal grain suggested farming families returned here season after season. Pits filled with pottery fragments and charred food pointed to repeated feasts, the kind of communal events that marked harvests, marriages, or rituals of renewal. Exotic materials, pitchstone from Arran, smoky quartz from distant regions, spoke of networks that reached across Scotland, carrying not only objects but also traditions and ideas. Carnoustie was not a forgotten outpost. It was plugged into a web of exchange and identity that spanned the Neolithic world, and the message spread further. Until it would take this discovery, many scholars were convinced that Scotland's earliest farmers lived in scattered hamlets that hardly made any effort for large-scale organisation. Monumental architecture was very commonly associated with Orkney, and complexes, such as the stone-built ones like the Ness of Brodgar, rose centuries later. But the Carnoustie Hall pushed the timeline back by a millennium and shifted attention to the mainland. Here, thus in Angus, communities had already embarked on construction on monumental scales far earlier than anticipated, as evidenced by social complexities. It presented a new vantage point for archaeologists to understand the shift to farmer lifestyles. With crops and animals came settlement, not just for survival, but as an expression of identity. This building gave farming families a space for meeting, decision-making, and the strengthening of alliances. Its size suggests leadership and planning, which imply perhaps emerging hierarchies or influential individuals directing the labor. In this way, the Carnoustie Hall was a fulcrum in the story of how once disparate groups became organized societies. The immediate results of finding modern stuff were the halting of construction of the new school pitches while guard archaeology finished its excavation. For the inhabitants of the locality, this sudden change of the sports field into a prehistoric landmark felt surreal. Parents and pupils who had been expecting goalposts now found themselves looking into trenches of history. Children had been asking questions on the way to school. Suddenly, those who once thought of archaeology as far and abstract realized that it was literally under their feet. The legacy carries on beyond Carnoustie. Artifacts recovered from the site, pottery shards, tools and charred remnants were deposited in regional collections, allowing the public to forge a link with this distant past. The audiences attending these public lectures and exhibitions were unusually large, a sign that the find generated interest in much wider circles far beyond Angus. What started off as a delay in construction turned into one of the landmark archaeological discoveries in Scotland for decades, attesting to the fact that marvellous history could be hidden in the most undistinguished of places. From a school pitch to a 6,000-year-old timber hall, the Carnoustie discovery proves how ordinary ground can conceal extraordinary history. It also raises haunting questions. How many other timber giants still lie hidden beneath our fields, waiting for a spade to uncover them? If this story left you speechless, like, comment and subscribe, and join us for our next deep dive into a discovery that overturns what we thought we knew about ancient Britain.